Hey everybody, TacticAngel here, back on the PlayStation 5 to take a look at another premium ship in World of Warships Legends. This time it's the Tier 6 premium German destroyer, Z-35. For this review, I'll start with the history, then we'll talk about the ship in-game, discuss commanders, run down the stats, and finish off with some gameplay. As always, check out the time codes if you do want to skip around. The Z-35 was a destroyer built as part of the Project 36B class of ships. She would be the first ship of that class, or subclass, depending on how you wanted to look at it. The Project 36A destroyers were ordered in two batches, the 36A and 36A Mob, or Mobilmachung, for mobilization destroyers. These are represented by the Z-23 and Z-39, respectively, in the game. The Project 1936B destroyers were, as their name might suggest, more of an incremental improvement than a revolution in German ship design. These ships would actually be ordered with the smaller 128mm 5-gun arrangement of the Project 1936 destroyers that preceded even the 1936As. But with a marginally improved anti-aircraft capability. This was in part due to the forward double turret that you'll find on the 1936A Mob destroyers being somewhat ill-suited and causing the ship to be top-heavy and unstable. In total, 8 of the 1936Bs were ordered, but only 5 were ever completed, and only 3 of those were ever commissioned into service. The way that works out was 3 were cancelled, 2 more were built, with 1 being destroyed in dock and the other one never having been completely kitted out. The Z-35 herself did not enjoy a long or successful career. Laid down in June 1941, launched in October 1942, and commissioned into service in September 1943, she would first see service in February 1944. At that point, she would deploy to the Baltic Sea, where she would spend her entire operational career, alongside her sister, the creatively named Z-36. Her initial tasks included convoy escorts in this region. By June, the destroyers were part of a task force centered around the Lützow, formerly the Lead Panzerschiff Deutschland, tasked with taking the Finnish island Åland should the Finns decide to prematurely leave the war. They didn't, so the operation was called off. By late July, she was sent with a 3-week mining operation off of Reval, modern-day Tallinn, Estonia. In October, she was part of Combat Group 2. She participated in the shelling of the Soviet positions on Ossel, or Saaremaa Island, also in modern-day Estonia. She was called away from this task, though, to assist the stricken cruiser Leipzig and Prince Eugen, who had collided with one another and escorted them back to port. In December 1944, Z-35 and Z-36 were back near Reval to lay additional mines. The operation was marred by poor weather, and in a thick fog the 2 destroyers wandered into an existing German minefield. This ended poorly for both Z-35 and Z-36, as they both happened upon mines, and both would sink on the evening of December 12th. Between the 2 ships, 540 men would go down with their destroyers, with just 87 survivors between them, all of whom ended up in Soviet custody. The Z-35 joins a crowd of at least a dozen premium destroyers at Tier 6 in World of Warships Legends. Though she is incredibly similar to her half-sister, the Z-39, there are a few things that make the Z-35 a fairly unique ship. As far as the strengths of the Z-35, what she brings to the table is, while most German destroyers have pretty good concealment, the Z-35 is better than even those. Combined with some probable commander choices, this is going to make you easily one of the stealthiest ships in any game you play. You can also use good stealth to get in close to many ships that you actually do want to get into a gunfight with, because the Z-35 does have a fairly nice main battery. Your guns fire quickly, and thanks to German HE, they penetrate most services on cruisers and battleships of equal or lower tier. And just to make this ship a triple threat, you also have a formidable, though not exceptional, set of torpedoes. Their chief advantage is a very comfortable range and a decent reload. Their one drawback, if you would consider it a drawback on a gunboat, is that they do somewhat unimpressive damage. Where the Z-35 suffers is that she is really not very maneuverable at all. It's a fairly slow ship with a wide turning circle, and it has among the worst rudder shifts of any destroyer at the tier. While the guns on the Z-35 are pretty formidable versus cruisers and Tier 6 battleships, it does somewhat suffer in knife fights against other destroyers, which, by the nature of equipment, is something you probably want to exploit in most cases. And really, the lack of consumables does hurt this ship somewhat. The Z-35 lacks a speed boost that is common to most destroyers, and this hurts your ability to get around the map. And while she is compensated for that basically with British smoke on the PC, you just get 2 charges of German smoke in Legends, and that's a bit underwhelming, even if she does have excellent sonar. Overall, this makes for a ship that is relatively comfortable to play, and for those of you familiar with ships like the Gaeta, the Maas, or Z-39, she doesn't really offer anything especially unique compared to her other German destroyer counterparts, but she is a little bit more on the gunny side of destroyers and still has fairly comparable torpedoes. She ends up with worse maneuverability than the Maas, pretty much in the same boat as the Z-39, but makes up for it by having slightly better main battery DPM and also having one of the best destroyer sonars in the entire game. Overall, this is more or less an even trade with the other 2 German destroyers, and which one you like the most is really going to depend mostly on whether or not you can engineer circumstances to play to your destroyer's advantage. Since the German destroyers are somewhere in the middle when it comes to being either a torpedo boat or a gunboat, you can actually take the ship in either direction. My sense, though, is that the Z-35 is best to lean in the direction of being a gunboat, and my first choice, therefore, for this ship would be Eric Bay. This commander generally suits you well if you think your primary duty in a destroyer is to kill other destroyers. Twist and Track will make that a lot easier, not only by cluing you into where they may be, but also by making your turret rotation considerably more competitive. Because with Bay, you basically get stealth for free with his base trait, that gives you a little bit more flexibility with a free inspiration to improve your guns or survivability. I would personally lean towards a little extra hit points or damage reduction. Needless to say, happening upon an enemy destroyer at close range with 50% more hit points than him and your guns faced in the correct direction can often have extremely deleterious effects on their survival. If you want to run this ship as a torpedo boat, then Maximilian von Spee is a good choice. He's going to help your torpedoes reload a little bit faster, do more competitive amounts of damage, and potentially reach well beyond 10 kilometers. Fragile Threat isn't a terrible idea here because frankly, you're still going to have more hit points than most Tier 6 destroyers, even after taking the penalty. I'd also take Destroy or Be Destroyed, at least if you're above rank 14, because it does help your speed issue. The downside of this build is basically mucking up your guns in every conceivable way, which will mostly hurt you in destroyer-on-destroyer gameplay. If you want to choose Reinhardt Scheer, my guess is that you would be doing this out of necessity. This isn't a really strong pick, really, and other than making a serviceable torpedo boat if you don't have any other options. I wouldn't categorize the Z-35 as an ideal open water fire starter due to its limited range, but you could improve your fire chance more than with other commanders if you wanted to use Scheer. You'll end up being in the area of a fairly average fire starter for a cruiser, which is respectable, but don't expect to be amazing, even after Burn It Down. And while usually there's something to be said for fully packed, with only 2 consumables benefiting from this, leaving your complicated German engine vulnerable to being knocked out is a recipe for disaster more often than not. If you really want better consumable versatility, taking Bay with Listen Closely makes a lot more sense considering the Z-35's consumable situation. As we jump into stats, I will compare this ship mostly to the other German destroyers at this tier, and thankfully we already have 2 to choose from. We will start with survivability because that just makes the most sense, and the Z-35 starts out in pretty good position. This 19,100 hit points makes it really healthy for a destroyer at tier 6, and actually would be healthy at tier 7. This is about 4,500 hit points more than most destroyers at her tier, and 500 behind the Z-39. Armor doesn't really matter that much because it's 8mm on the superstructure and 19mm on the hull. This is exactly average and exactly what you're going to find on Z-39, minus the front turret face of the forward turret, which is where it gets that weird 30mm rating if you were looking at this screen. The artillery on the Z-35 is also very capable. You have 5 128mm guns, arranged 2 fore, 2 aft, and 1 in the middle, just like the Gaeta, Benson, and Fletcher. This, combined with an excellent 3.8 second reload, means that the Z-35 does feel like a very capable gunboat. With 10.5 kilometer range, that's a little on the short side even for a destroyer, so you might not want to be an open water harrier unless you're poking a distracted target. You will need to pay attention to this 22.5 second turret traverse because that's a little longer than average, but if you build for it, you can make it quite comfortable still. Where the Z-35 isn't perfect for knife fighting is this low HE damage per shot. It's still better than most destroyers, but you should count on American ships chewing you up pretty badly, and for the most part you do want to take advantage of your stealth in pouncing on other destroyer targets. Your 6% fire chance isn't all that high, but the high rate of fire still means that she's decent as a fire starter for a destroyer. The other thing to note here is that this is German HE, so you do get improved penetration. That doesn't generally matter when dealing with other destroyers, but it can be helpful when you're punching cruisers or even some battleships. If you can get your AP into the mix, Z-35 has easily the highest AP DPM for any destroyer at the tier, and in addition to your torpedoes, means that at close range there's a lot of destroyers and even some cruisers that won't enjoy fighting you inside of 4 or 5 kilometers, which is probably about the range that you could expect to get decent results with this AP. But speaking of those torpedoes, you do have the standard 2x4 arrangement of 533mm torpedoes that you see on many of the other German destroyers. They have a 90-second torpedo reload, same as the Moss and Z-39, but with only 13,700 damage. That's a bit low. Not just against Germans, but 10% lower than the average at the tier. They have a pretty excellent 9-kilometer range, and though this is the German standard, 65 knots is 4 knots faster than average, and quite nice on fish that can swim this far. As far as this package, this does mean that you're a little low in terms of your overall torpedo damage potential, but you do have respectable range and decent speed to make up for that. AA is always hard to describe if it isn't god tier and it isn't laughable. Then it's just kind of a thing. There are 2 ways to look at this. As a destroyer, your AA is not expected to be very good unless you're American. And yeah, the Z-35's AA is not very good. When compared to other destroyers though, she's about average. And so it is kind of a blessing that this ship only comes with a 3.5 kilometer range, which doesn't greatly outrange your detectability from air, because if there's anything that's annoying in the game, it's having aircraft carriers follow your tracer fire back to your ship. You shouldn't expect too much out of the AA suite, but if you don't expect too much, these guns will not disappoint you. Next comes maneuverability, and this is definitely not the strong suit for Z-35. There are definitely less maneuverable ships at the tier, but not all that many. In short, you are a knot slower than average, you have a very wide turning circle, though not the widest that you'll find at the tier. The thing about any ship that does have a wider turning circle is that it's about 20% faster than you. And then you also have a fairly slow rudder, so the short story is you're not going anywhere very quickly, particularly since you don't have a speed boost. You better know where you want to go, because you don't turn all that well. It does take a bit longer to change your direction if you want to go somewhere else. As we come to concealment, this is very good for Z-35. You've got a 200 meter advantage versus average, and that means you can kit this out for sub 5 kilometer sea detectability if you really want to. This advantage drops to just 100 meters from the air, and due to your 5-inch or so guns, you have a comfortable 2.5 kilometer firing penalty from smoke. At your tier, really only the Yukikaze and Asashio are stealthier, and the stats you see here are very nearly exactly what the Akatsuki enjoys, so very nice. Last but not least, we'll talk about consumables. You only get 3, first of which is obviously your damage control, which everyone gets. Nothing special here. The other 2 consumables you have are exact copies of smoke and sonar that you find on Z-39. This isn't exactly surprising. The bad news about this, though, is that this is German smoke, meaning that it has a poor dispersion time and low duration. You start with just 2 of them, and for veterans on PC, you will notice this is quite different from the smoke the ship gets there. Next, we have sonar, which is more or less god tier for a destroyer. The 3.5 kilometer torpedo detection should help you a bit should someone fire torpedoes at you, and even more impressive is the 5 kilometer ship detection range, which means that if you dedicate yourself to any level of stealth, by the time a DD realizes you're engaging it, smokes, and turns away, there's a real good chance that it's already too late. And now to the, quote, good part, I guess. We are going to go into some gameplay. We are going to be on Haven, a favorite map among cruiser players, I think, probably. I like this map well enough. And as the game starts out, we're going to go ahead, roll out straight forward. We are in a capture the base mode. This is not my preferred way to play capture the base. I find that having a destroyer is a lot more fun in domination. But occasionally you gotta showcase different types of gameplay. I will go ahead, put my commander up on the screen. This is pretty darn close to what I would suggest usually running. I could see where you might want to boost your sonar and get 4 consumables that last a pretty short period of time. That would actually be really nice on the recharge and add a lot to your versatility, possibly. But otherwise, increasing your HP so you can survive those gunfights a little bit better, or doing something like that to make your survivability better, or your guns a little bit better. These are probably good choices. I probably wouldn't just buff HE damage because you have such low HE damage that it's probably not worth it. But anyway, I'm going to go ahead and take that off of the screen because, the game's already started. And we should probably pay at least a little bit of attention to it. That's what I tell myself when I play the game. In any case, you can see there's a smoke screen over there. That's a curious thing to see on the water. We actually do know that it's a Belfast because while I was rambling on about things, we did see, of course, that a Belfast started that smoke screen, and we're just going to go ahead and send those fish out there towards the torpedo magnet that is smoke. Part of that is obviously, as a radar cruiser, if someone can get them out of the game as quickly as possible, that would be great, because they will make your life more difficult. Ordinarily, you probably don't want to be the person who has to do that, but Belfast's radar is 8.4, and your torpedoes are 9.0, so he doesn't know I'm there, and there you go. He didn't really have a reason to pop his radar. A lot of times when you sit and smoke in a Belfast, it might be a good idea to have your hydro active just for the fun of it, but sometimes that means you're not going to have your hydro when you really need it. In any case, it's a good start to the battle, as our German narrator has informed us. Now we have a York coming up upon us. I'm trying to stay kind of close to that Scharnhorst to give him Der Will zu Wiederaufbau, the will to rebuild, but I don't think he has it, and I don't want to sit inside the York's impressive sonar. Now, one thing is, obviously, you actually have really impressive sonar yourself, and a big part of making this ship really work is trying to put yourself into positions where you can use that without putting yourself into positions where you die immediately afterwards, or during, really. So, the temptation with Z-35, because it's a good gunboat, and also because it has that special ability, is to kind of put yourself out there like some radar cruisers like to do every so often, which is be a little too aggressive, then you find yourself without a speed boost, and you have kind of this awful smoke situation, and then, you know, you can't get away and you die. So you don't do very well. Now, I have launched some additional torpedoes against the Prinz Eitel Friedrich, and I'm going to go ahead and continue to kind of just own this space. Dallas is getting close enough that I think for a minute maybe I want to shoot it. It's my experience that you really do have to be quite close to really poorly armored targets in order for the AP to actually reliably penetrate or possibly citadel targets. So even though you do have fantastic AP damage per second, a lot of times what you're going to be using that for is targeting superstructures of enemy battleships. Now we're going to get a little bit of a taste for what you can do against cruisers there. You saw some pretty decent penetrations, but nothing exceptional. I have a better sonar than the La Galissonière, and that's even assuming his sonar is active. It's a good blind shot by him there, but we continue to put our shells into the La Galissonière until he gets pretty close to our smoke penalty for firing. So we stopped that for a second. He's turned broadside enough that we can put a wide spread out there on the water, and of course his boat is wide enough that it's going to be pretty tricky to dodge, and we only need one. Best case scenario with that sort of strategy is that you're doing it against another destroyer, because obviously this is a really key advantage for a German ship to have against other destroyers, the ability to kind of fire protected from smoke while not being really subject to detection yourself. The number of Maas and Gatas that I saw out there this week was a little surprising, which did cut into my fun, but I did have some pretty fun results, even though I ended up with games that I ultimately didn't think really showed off this ship just quite right. So anyway, we are going to kind of roll out here a little bit more to the west. I think trying to sneak out further to the west is probably a bad idea considering my speed, and also considering the island situation. I think I'm kind of opening myself up to being spotted. It does also look like several of their ships don't want to go there either, which means why not stay more or less where I'm at and take advantage of the fact that they're going to move towards a position I can already shoot at. So there we see the Dallas. Dallas is one of the more dangerous ships that are still alive on the enemy team. Getting a feel for when people are going to come around that corner. I'm actually thinking that the Dallas is going to accelerate faster than that, and that there was a battleship that was backing up. As it turns out, that Colorado is doing exactly what I expected him to do, and my blind fire at least is looking okay so far. We are using preset 2, which allows us to follow our shots, and we do manage to land 3 pretty decent hits against Colorado. That causes some flooding, so he obviously immediately damacons. I think I flubbed around with my controller a little bit and accidentally exposed myself, so I continue to shoot because why not? Passing behind this island is going to lose me my spot anyway, and I might get a fire out of it. This is one of the things about having a really low fire starting percentage. You do tend to have to take a lot of shots to get anything out of it. And so starting fires with this ship versus something like the Z-39 is, particularly if you only have a couple of shots, not as reliable. Now the one thing is you can see on the minimap that I am kind of wedged between several terrible options. This is a time when I would normally want to use an engine boost to kind of get out of the way. We're kind of curious what's over here, and as it turns out, it's a Miyoko with near about no life. So actually, rotate the guns thanks to twist and track. Pretty easy to do. One of the nice things about shooting at tier 6 cruisers is that you can do a pretty reliable amount of damage. If I had waited just a little bit longer, I probably could have done that without really taking a whole lot of damage in return. You know, by working in my back turrets. But whatever. The engine mod is probably what saved me there, because this ship is not very maneuverable. So reducing my speed there helped me to avoid getting killed by that torpedo. Since Prince Eitel Friedrich has other things to worry about, we do go ahead and open fire on him. This shows you a little bit that you do still kind of have to aim for weak spots. It's a little bit more forgiving due to your quarter pen, but obviously not all of those are doing damage. At this point, the last person is, I think, on that line. I mean, I know he's pretty much on that line. So I think, we're doing a review. Why don't I go look for him? As it turns out, he's not super interested in fighting anymore, and it makes sense considering that there aren't a whole lot of people left on his team. I'm going to tell you the short story is that I'm not going to throw the game on the off chance that I can get this slow destroyer to the other end of the map by the time that guy caps. I turn around and take the win, because I'm not going to do that to my team. Just because I want to make a fancy review. So anyway, closing thoughts on Z-35. This is a perfectly capable destroyer that, if you really like ships like the Gaeta, you'll probably be right at home with. That said, I have a pretty good understanding of what this ship is supposed to be good at, and I was able to implement that several times. I also have a much more acute and a very functional, if not ever-present, understanding of her poor handling characteristics. At least while the ship is actually moving, and kind of the wonky consumable arrangement that comes with it. So I like it. I actually like it quite a bit. I usually felt really good playing this ship, but my experience with it says it doesn't cover the field like the other destroyers, and so it lacks a certain amount of carry potential. So even if I really like how this ship feels, except when I really need to turn, I actually have performed a lot better in the Gaeta traditionally, and even Z-39. But those are just my thoughts. Let me know what you guys think down in the comments section. Thank you everyone for watching, and as always, I hope to see you on the next one.